Today we're going to talk about the lateral hump. What I thought about when I was doing this series is to sort of focus on different parts of the head, because I think it's very esoteric and we don't really understand what one part of the head does, one part of the other head does when I'm doing hair restoration. The lateral hump is an upside down U on the side of the head that is distinctly different from the center for many, many reasons. First of all, the shape. It actually is a upside down U shape in someone that is losing hair, and it continues to recede downward as we lose hair in an upside down U fashion until it just becomes confluent with the horseshoe on the back. The way that I actually create the recipient sites, or the sites that will accommodate the grafts, is completely different for the lateral hump than the central area. In the central area, which usually dominates most of our needs to do hair restoration, except for someone progressively bald, say someone in Norwood 5 or 6 that is beginning to recede on the sides, and obviously a 7, which would be very, very low. The lateral hump doesn't play a large role in the early phases of hair restoration, but plays a much more important role in the later phases. I always think in my head, as I'm doing a transplant in the central area, how much hair do I have left to feed the lateral hump if I need to in the future years. So I always think about the reserve that I have for this one area. A lot of people look at a reserve for the crown, which I love to do. It's one of the most technically interesting areas to do and most beautiful. But at the same time, the lateral hump is where my brain goes to when I see someone, let's say 30 years old, and I'm doing a transplant into the central area. How much density does he have, and can I feed this hump? Because as I build the central area of the head, I want to make sure that as this starts to recede, that it will continue to match the central work. And so it's really important that you think of current situations of hair loss as well as future hair loss, and the lateral hump is the area that I'm very, very focused on. The lateral humps is the area from this canthus, or the outer part of the eye, going outward. It's the area where if you look at someone doing what's called a comb over, that you can see that it doesn't look right, and your eye doesn't know how it's telling it's a comb over versus it's not a comb over. And the way that you can tell it's a comb over is the fact that the hair that's on this side, that's outside of the canthus, should arch downward. We're going to talk more about that in a moment. So the hair direction is completely different in the lateral hump compared to the center, and when you take hair that should be going downward and you move it over sideways, it doesn't look natural. So let's talk exactly what is the pattern design in the lateral hump compared to the central area. The lateral hump, this area, as you see in the graphic here, goes forward and it begins to cascade downward. So it actually, at the very top recess of this, matches the central area of the head, where it actually goes forward, and then, but the only difference is it begins to diverge downward. The very anterior border of the lateral hump is called the anterior temporal area, or anterior temporal region, and that's where we have other videos where we talk about framing the face and how important the temporal border is. But the general configuration of the entire temporal region right here is called the lateral hump. And the reason it's called lateral hump because it looks like a camel hump. And that hump, the more progressive loss, as we said, the more you're going to actually see the definition of that circle of the hump. But when it's filled with hair, as it is in someone, for example myself here, you don't see an upside down U because it's so confluent with the central area. What I'm worried about when I'm rebuilding a hump is that's falling away. So the best way when I'm building the design work, and that's what's so important, is when you're working with a hair restoration surgeon, that he knows the patterns of hair loss so that he can design the proper restoration. I'm looking for how that hair arches forward and then angles down, and so I'm actually creating blending effect from the central part of the head over to the side. In fact, that transition zone that goes from the outer border into the lateral hump is called the lateral crease, and there's this gradual evolution of drop. What's so important is when you're creating these sites of drop, that you make each of the sites with very, very gentle transition zones. There's almost no more than a few degrees of change between each level of the hump going downward. And the reason why that's so important is that natural hair pattern, the way that God has created our head, is just absolutely a work of art. If you really look carefully at the the hair. Look at someone that's non-balding, that has a really closely shorn head, and I think you're going to be amazed at the transition zones. The transition zones are never abrupt. So when a hair restoration surgeon works on the lateral hump, you've got to take pride in making sure that every angle is only transitioning by several degrees between one plane to the next plane all the way downward. And that's a lot of fun for me. I actually get a lot of enjoyment. I almost get an endorphin rush doing these sites because I can actually see the shape of pattern that I've designed before my wonderful dissection team actually then places those grafts into the design work. So it's a lot of fun. So the lateral hump is really, really important. Now, there's also something what's interesting is not to frighten you, but in someone that has progressive hair loss that doesn't go back and get a transplant to lateral hump, they can also get what's called a reverse comb over, which essentially is that, I hate to mention some famous people, but if you look at Joe Biden, he's got a reverse comb over. What he's done is he's lost enough in the lateral hump that he's combing his hair over to cover the lateral hump this way, because his transplant in the center is such a fashion that he's combing over the lateral hump. So it's almost a reverse comb over. What I try to do, I had a gentleman, here's an example, and the reverse comb over is not that bad compared to a central comb over, as long as you can get it covered. The interesting thing is that what I remember a gentleman that came in had really bad plugs. I had limited donor capacity of what I needed to do, so I had to work very creatively to try to get his restoration to work. So what I did in this situation is actually use the reverse comb over as a way to create a great effect without necessarily using a lot of grafts. So I worked with most of my grafts at the left lateral hump where where it was exposed, because his part combed this way, and I put fewer grafts on the right, so I allowed his comb over to comb over it in a very natural way and just created a scatter zone so that you didn't see a bald spot on this side, and then worked on a lot of density on the left so that I could create the part in such a fashion that he would get maximal travel distance, which is called the cascade effect. For the hair going this way, compared, if you think about it, if he combs this way over the right lateral hump, he's going to have greater capacity for that hair to travel and create more density. I can use every graft here for its maximal effect. The cascade effect, which is the idea that if you put hair in a certain part of the region, like over here, it creates a better travel distance. It's a very important concept, so you can actually use the same number of grafts more effectively than another person, just distributing it haphazardly. Let me use an example in the lateral hump. When I work with the lateral hump, I work with a little bit more density toward the central upper region as a lower region with stronger grafts. The reason for that is those grafts travel a greater distance, so they actually have a double whammy effect compared to the grafts below it. So it's the same region when I work with the crown. I work with a greater degree of density on the upper arc of it than the lower arc, so that upper arc creates a lift effect when you're looking at a person from the front view, and it also arcs over to cover the bottom half. So the cascade effect in the lateral hump is using grafts wisely in your distribution so that you get maximal gains with minimal number of grafts, especially in someone that has had maybe multiple transplants, so that you can use those grafts effectively for maximal visual camouflage. So hopefully this concept of the idea of a lateral hump, it's a bit confusing, I know, if you're not in the world of hair restoration. Of course, I'd be more than honored to talk to you in person about how I could apply these concepts in you as an individual. But I just wanted to understand the complexity of hair restoration is not just sticking in sites and hoping for the best. It's truly designing a pattern that makes sense for every part of the head. In this case, we're talking about lateral hump and its importance, especially in later stage hair restoration.